of words is at least as important as the meaning, and sometimes more important than the meaning of the words. And so it's a genre that appreciates the music of words. And that can occur in different degrees with different writers. Nonsense writers write it in many different ways. And so you'll have, on one hand, you have Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear, you have John Lennon, you have Alan Watts, the Zen philosopher, all writing vastly different kinds of nonsense. But one of the things that ties them together generally is an awareness of sound, an awareness of language as music, and the exploitation of the sound of words, and the exploration of meaning that goes beyond the semantic.
I see.
Now, another way that I've thought about this is I was working on a play. I was called in to be the nonsense consultant.
I see.
For a play that was produced in Canada by the Only Animal theater company based in Vancouver. And they wanted to, Kendra Fanconi was the playwright and the director, and she wanted to create a play that had a nonsensical world. And so she asked me to help, help make this happen on stage. And of course, this presented many difficulties because nonsense is usually considered to be a literary genre, a literary exercise.
That's right.
It's based in words.
That's right.
And when you're on stage, you have a lot more tools than you have words, of course, but you have other tools at your disposal. And so it was a challenge to find ways to translate nonsense to the stage. So I was also called upon to deal with the music. And a friend of mine, Mark Sylvester, was the composer for this production. And he was asked to create music that goes along with the nonsensical world. And so we had many discussions about how you can take the theory of nonsense and try to translate it into music, how to create musical nonsense. And we went around and around, and I would often posit things that I knew from my literary theoretical training, and he would try to process them, and they weren't working in his musical way of thinking. He wasn't able to create a kind of music that he thought came from the theoretical basis and literary basis of nonsense. But I have not given up the fight to try to create a kind of music that represents nonsense in a way. And but it's not easy.
I see. Because one thing that impressed me at the Berkeley talk that he gave on Tuesday, through remarkable usage of examples, was this. Correct me if I'm wrong. There were certain cultures which did not have an established vocation of nonsense literature. But you did argue that you somehow managed, although it was exceedingly difficult, to exemplify the nonsensicality of their literature sometimes, not necessarily through words, but also through sounds. Am I right?
Yes.
How did that work? Let us take some concrete examples.
Well, if you're, there are different ways of creating nonsense, and it is, by way of definition, it is a manipulation and a play with language and logic. And if we're talking about sounds, then we're going over to the side of language generally. And it can be a situation in which there are only sounds being made and not even words. And I think you may be referring to this kind of thing.
Precisely.
Where
That's
just
right.
sounds.
You captured it quite well. Yes.
This is technically it's really not quite what we would call literary nonsense or nonsense literature.
Okay.
But it can approach it sometimes, and we can get a little bogged down in our own definitions of nonsense sometimes. We have a tradition of nonsense that comes from the West that we've studied, and we want to think that nonsense always is this. But I can give you one example of a nonsense performance that I got in Kenya.
Please do.
I was doing field work in Kenya this last summer as a part of my sabbatical, and I was speaking to the Luo people in western Kenya along Lake Victoria, and many people from the village had come to tell their stories and to talk to me and to give me their nonsense and many other things. And I spent several days in long performances under a giant hut on Osiri Hill, near Osiri Beach, a very beautiful area.
I loved, by the way, the pictures that you brought of Kenya and
you.
South Africa. Yeah. You're a great photographer also.
Well, thank you. It was such a lovely area, and they have this. Adrian Onyando is a professor at a university in Kenya, and he and his wife have created an organization there where they have a library, and it's the only library in this very rural part of Kenya for many, many miles. And the library serves not just as a library, though, but as a community center.
I see.
They help children get educated, and they help people pursue education in various ways. So this is it's a kind of central meeting point for the people who live in the area, who are farmers and fishermen, and we spent several days there, and they gave us many examples of their stories and their songs, and I believe we'll have some opportunity to talk about some of these things that they presented to us. But at the end of all of this, Adrian and I were hesitant to ask them to give us nonsense, to use the word in Luo, the language they speak is Luo, to use the word for nonsense in their language, because he wasn't sure what we would get. And he was afraid that they would think we were crazy.
Yes.
So we didn't use that word. We used lots of other words to try to describe what we were looking for. But in the end, I said, Adrian, ask them to give us nonsense. Use the word nonsense.
And see what they come up with.
Yeah, just to see. Because I have my definitions of it. They very well may have their own definitions of it.
That's right.
And as soon as he said that, he asked the crowd, okay. And of course, they're all speaking in Luo. And he asks the crowd, now, give me your nonsense. And several people volunteered. And they would come up onto the stage and do a kind of ridiculous, silly pantomime, shadow play kind of thing.
I see.
And they started kind of jumping around and gesticulating in particular ways, almost telling a story, but not quite telling a story.
I see.
And making these sounds that sometimes had words mixed in, but didn't really quite fit together. And it was, and everybody was on the floor laughing. The crowd thought it was hilarious. And apparently, this is a kind of tradition that they have. And they were completely amazed that we might want to witness such a trifle, such silliness. But in the end, it shows itself to be quite a serious art form, so to speak, because play is always serious.
Of course.
And so it's this adult, playful, quasi-narrative way of acting and gesticulating and creating sounds and some words and some partial words, mixing it all together. And in this situation, most of what they were doing were sounds, which